everyone, and welcome to Grieving Hearts this evening. I'll just ask at this time, before we get started, that you please silence or put your phones on vibrate, just to avoid any interruptions. I'll introduce Christine McMillan, who will be leading us this evening and taking good care of us.
Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you to Alyssa as well, who's going to be handling the videotaping, and to the rest of the wonderful team here. Those of you who don't know me, I am a practitioner in private practice, and I've been working with Families First in a professional capacity for going on 8 years now. And what I truly appreciate about Families First, not only do they take care of the families after the funeral, they offer these presentations to the community free of charge, whether you use their services or not. And I do appreciate being able to be given the opportunity to come on here and provide some information about what it's like to grieve and mourn in a culture that doesn't support our grief. So while I am very happy to be here, I am sad that you're here, not only as a result of grief, because it will enter all of our lives. It's entered my life, expectedly as well as unexpectedly. And this was all before I came into bereavement as a career. But you're here because of what we call an unanticipated, a sudden, unexpected death. And that presents a different set of stressors on you as the bereaved. So we're going to talk about that tonight. We've got a fairly small group. This is not a support group, so I hope you don't expect, because we're sitting around in round tables, that we will be dialoguing a lot. But I would like you to ask me any questions, ask me for clarification, and I will do the very best I can. We'll be here about an hour, a little over an hour, depending on how, I guess, clear I am and how many questions you have. In terms of housekeeping, Heather already talked about our phones so that we're not disturbed. If you do need to get up at any point in time to stretch your legs, just to give yourself a little break, feel free to do that. I certainly won't be distressed over that. The washrooms, if you haven't been here before, out the back door, both men and women washrooms, ladies and gentlemen washrooms. Any questions at all before we start? I see some familiar faces. Who have been to Grieving Hearts presentations in the past? Okay, awesome, okay. So I didn't scare you away. Good. All right. So before we get, I keep forgetting I'm not mic'd. Maybe I better hold on to this. Before we get started, I just want you to get comfortable in your seats, okay? I'd like you to place your feet on the ground, okay? At least for now. Get comfortable, settle into your chairs, and we're going to take a deep breath in through our nose. And we're going to exhale slowly out through our mouth for a couple of breaths. So in for 1, 2, 3, 4, and out through your mouth, 2, 3, 4. In again, slowly. And as you exhale, just focus on whatever muscles that might be tense, where you're holding your stress. We do that so subconsciously. So just release whatever stress you might be feeling. Grief in and of itself is a heavy topic, but what we're going to talk about today might be even more triggering to you. So I want you to not judge whatever you're feeling at any given moment. I want you to observe it. I want you to notice your feelings, but I don't want you to judge them in any way. Okay? Anytime you're feeling a little anxious, try the breathing exercise, or if you need to, certainly get up and stretch your legs. I'll ask you halfway through whether or not you want a break, and I'll take my lead from all of you. Okay? So, I'd like you to just consider this scenario. I want you to imagine yourself on a street corner, not in Windsor, say in downtown Toronto, and you're waiting for the red to turn green. And opposite, on the other corner, that's going to cross and come towards you, is this thing called grief. And you can't turn around, you can't walk away, you can't hide. The light turns green, and this entity comes towards you and hits you in the face. But you know it was coming, and so you had a moment or moments to brace yourself. You prepared. You knew that you couldn't avoid it. So you get knocked down. You might be up, not conscious for a while. You come to, you're hurting, but you know what hit you. Scenario number 2, you're on that same street corner in downtown Toronto. And you're waiting for the light to turn. There's no entity that you see on the other side of the intersection. But before the light turns green, you get hit from behind with the same force as in scenario number 1. You fall to the ground, you lose consciousness, you regain consciousness, you wonder why your jaw hurts and your head hurts. You wonder why you were chosen to be the recipient of that pain. It takes you quite a while to get oriented to where you are, why you're hurting, what the purpose was, who hit you. The pain can be experienced the same way, but overall the responses and the time it takes us to get oriented to a sudden death, an unexpected death, is very different than an anticipated death. So keep that in mind as we go through this evening. Arthur Toynbee said there are always 2 parties to a death, the person who dies and the survivors who are bereaved. You are the survivors. You are the ones who have to make sense of why you were hit, who hit you. Orient yourself to this world without your loved one. And if you need, you go to somebody like me to get a little support and direction. So when we talk about sudden death, I don't know all of you here. So I don't know what death you might be experiencing. Even if somebody was diagnosed with an illness and the date of death, and the date of the diagnosis to the date of death was relatively quick, we see certain things that mimic somebody who's experienced a true unexpected death. My mother, she died 18 years ago. She was diagnosed with cancer, and within 11 days she died. I would consider that kind of a sudden death. At least that's how it was experienced in my family. Any questions about this? Anything up there? Any type of death that is specific to your experience that I haven't listed up here that you'd be comfortable sharing? Okay. So this is a very general, although it's specific to a sudden death, it's general in the sense that I can't obviously speak to how experiencing these different types of death are going to affect each one of you, but that is the case. An accidental overdose is very different than somebody dying in a car accident. suicide. It presents differently. But generally speaking, if you've experienced an unexpected death, you will most probably relate to most of what we're going to talk about tonight. So what we see that's pretty consistent with people that have experienced a sudden death, this initial period of shock, where you're trying to orient yourself after you find yourself in the sidewalk. Now that actually comes with any type of death. There's a period of shock. But it's far more intense with an unexpected death. And it lends itself, because it was unexpected, to a sense of disbelief and unreality. Because we're just not hardwired to be able to grasp the reality of someone being here one moment and not the next moment. We just cannot do it. We can eventually, but not at that moment. So just because your head might know, the heart takes very much longer to catch up. This is actually a bit of a shock absorber, the numbness and the denial. And what you will see, and maybe you experience yourself, is a period of getting on with business. That's because the shock lasts much longer. We also see feelings of vulnerability. And vulnerability is, it's the feeling of being exposed to harm or to an attack. And obviously, if something that you were not expecting happened to you, you're going to be hypervigilant then and feeling very, very vulnerable to it happening again, even though cognitively it may not make sense, logically, but there's that feeling of vulnerability. Many times I'll hear if a parent has lost a child, they feel overprotective of their other children. Or if you lost any loved one unexpectedly, you get hypervigilant about other people that you're attached to. When we're emotionally dysregulated, it takes our thinking and our logical brain offline. And so that reduces our capacity to make decisions. In some cases, the bereaved might be left with a lingering sense of hope in the cases where a body hasn't been recovered. And it's almost like, should I be grieving or should I not be grieving? Everything points to a death, but there is no body. And so we hold on to just a little bit of hope that maybe it was a mistake. We also see that when a death has happened geographically removed from where we are. Maybe it didn't happen, maybe they were wrong. You are also deprived of any opportunity to prepare for emotionally with your loved one. Any regrets, unfinished business, things you might have said, things you might have wanted to apologize for, things that we were putting off. And many of us live that way. We so often think we've got it forever. There's also a feeling of guilt. Again, we see that in anticipated deaths, but it's heightened with unexpected deaths. Because an unexpected death, again, it's not logical, somehow leaves us with the feeling we could have intervened and prevented it. I should have given him the keys. I should have made sure they went to the doctor. He wouldn't have had the heart attack. I should have stayed with them when they seemed so sad. So there's this guilt that we didn't do something. It's very often misplaced. Then there's a sense of helplessness, which is very closely related to vulnerability. As human beings, we like to be in control. We don't like being helpless. We don't like feeling out of control. And so when we're feeling helpless, sometimes you may see anger, rage, or on the other end of the spectrum, you might see immobilization. You freeze. Well, I can't do anything anyway. Because of some of the deaths that was on the third slide, you might not receive the social support that you need. We're not good with supporting anybody who's grieving, but there's certain deaths that people tend to stay away from in terms of ongoing support. Deaths that aren't understood, deaths that somehow judgment is placed on the person who died or their families. And so that deprives you of the much needed support. And again, human beings want to make sense of things. They want to give meaning to things. I have a client right now whose son was killed. And all she keeps saying is, it's meaningless. It's meaningless. It makes no sense. And with that, it shatters our sense of order and predictability. Again, we like order, we like schedules. We like to know, where do we turn up, what day, what time, what happens if we're late. You don't expect to say goodbye to your spouse when they're off on their way to work and don't expect them to come home that night. Either because of a workplace accident, an MVA. There's a sense of predictability. You go to work, you come home. I send my kids to school, they come home. A gunman doesn't go into a nursery school. That's not part of our world. It doesn't make any sense. And along with that, because we can't count now, or we're more fragile in terms of counting on things after a sudden death, we then go into a state of hyperarousal, right? That fight or flight. We're always waiting for the other shoe to drop. And that has devastating effects on our body, physically. If there's constantly cortisol and adrenaline circulating in the body. Constantly waiting. Your loved one, a loved one goes to the corner store and you're just expecting that phone call because the worst has already happened to you. Because the state of shock and denial can last a longer period, somebody who's bereaved by an unexpected death also runs the risk of delaying the grief process. That also happens in the case of, say, a homicide death, where the actual process of bereavement, which is learning to start living in the absence of your loved one, it can't start until after the criminal justice system has been completed. So your grief is placed on hold while there's focus on catching the perpetrator, the court process. You're distracted by all of that. Your focus is on that. So in those cases, that could lead to delayed grief as well. So in cases where that's happened to clients of mine, it might be 2 or 3 years later that they start to actually learn to live learn to live their routines without their loved one. And our society by that time has forgotten about them. You know, they'll hear things like, what do you mean? It's been 3 years. Well, the clock hadn't started for them emotionally. And along the same lines is if your loved one's death resulted in any type of involvement with the medical, legal, criminal justice system, it prolongs the process. The media might be involved, which complicates it even more. You're deprived of the opportunity of grieving in private. It's splashed all across, the papers. So these are the things that make an unexpected and a sudden death, or grieving a sudden death, more difficult and complicated. And it's more layered. So it's not just the pain. Things are prolonged and more intense. Any questions about any of that? Would anybody like me to review it or expand on anything? No? Just by a kind of a nod. Have you? Yes?
It's not that you have that point, state of hyper-arousal. Is that where you're like just totally vigilant, you're like on edge all the time?
Yes. Yes. I remember, as I said, I've had both I guess my mother could be considered a sudden death too, but the reason I got into bereavement 27 years ago was that I lost my first child. She was stillborn at 7 months. And my parents came from Toronto to support us. And I remember having to say goodbye to them. They were driving home down the 401. I was panicking. I was panicking that they wouldn't survive it. My heart was racing. I didn't want them to go. There was a little sense of relief when I knew they had gotten there safely. And if you happen to be a little bit more anxious than the norm, then it's going to be exacerbated, that hypervigilance. My husband goes out to the store. I want him close by me. Because the worst has happened. Again, it's not logical. One has nothing to do with the other. But neither is love. Love is not logical and grief is not logical. But that hypervigilance can be dealt with, it can be managed. But what I'm saying is it's very common early in the process, and it's heightened with an unexpected death. Because we have this sense that it happens to other people. It doesn't come into my world. So what is this thing we call grief? Well, it plays havoc, as we all know, with our emotions. Anger, sadness, profound sadness, longing, regret, guilt, anger, rage. See a lot of rage with my families of homicide. A lot of rage. Anger at the person who died in some cases. And that's complicated. That's very difficult to share with a lot of people. But know that it's normal. So, what is surprising is we can experience feelings that we wouldn't normally associate with us or our personality. You might start feeling jealous, or envious, or resentful. I'm here to say that that's okay at the beginning of the process. Those need to be addressed, they need to be worked on, so that it doesn't gain a foothold and become part of your personality. But grief also disorganizes our thinking. As I said, it takes our brains offline. Decision-making, concentration, focus is out the window for a while. Ever experienced going into a room in your home and forgetting why you were there, and then leaving that room and going into the next room, and then remembering why you were in the kitchen because you forgot to eat? It scatters our mind. And that's frightening because, again, we don't normalize any of this in our society. We just do such a big disservice. And because grief is stress, let alone a sudden death, stress is manifested in the body. Things that you don't consciously remember, your body remembers. Your sleeping could be disrupted. You could forget to eat, or alternatively, you could eat too much. You could get digestive issues, headaches, backaches. So where are you holding your stress right now? Is it in your jaws, in your shoulders? It affects how we react and interact with other people. Most of my clients, this has been my experience, is that people have been very disappointed with the lack of support or the type of support they've received. Because we just don't do grief very well here in our society. We're very uncomfortable with emotional pain. But if you broke your leg, I'll be there. I have no problem with that. I can help you with that. But I'm going to feel very helpless if you lost your partner, or your mother, or your father, or your baby. I'm not going to know what to do to make it better. But you see, that's the thing. All you need is someone to sit with you, to hold your hand, to listen to you. They don't need to do anything. We might become too clingy, which can affect relationships. We might distance ourselves from people. We might not accept invitations and then wonder why there's nobody there to support us. And then lastly, it affects our belief system, or how we look at the world. And I don't necessarily mean, your religious beliefs, though it does certainly encompass that. But now, how do you make sense of the world when this tragedies happen to you? How do you keep putting one foot in front of the other? So these are the demands that grief places on you. So you take all of those things and you double it or triple it with an unexpected death. But believe it or not, it's all normal and natural. If you're still not functioning and feeling and experiencing acute grief years later, then that's very different. Then your grief has become prolonged grief. And there's actually a disorder, a diagnosis for that. Prolonged grief disorder. Any questions about that? Anybody experience an anticipated grief and then you're here because of unexpected grief? Are you able to point to any major differences that you experienced you'd like to share? Did you have a sense of integrating it quicker into your life story with an anticipated death? That's usually the case, because there was some sort of preparation that was afforded to you if you took advantage of it. So, in summary again, your responses may be more intense and experienced for a longer period of time. Harriet Smith, who lost her 10-year-old son whose 10-year-old son died after surgery that he had survived, says the first sensation a parent has at the news that his child is dead is one of numbness, a sense of not actually being the bereaved party. I recall feeling that terrible time that none of this was real. It was not actually happening, and certainly not to me. It is almost a sensation of having an injection of Novocaine in your gums. It is as if the dental procedure was happening to somebody else. The numbness stayed with me and would come in waves, just as my weeping and sorrow would come in waves. For a grieving parent, that can be thankful. For that, a grieving parent can be thankful. If we had to face the enormity of our loss for every waking minute, I am certain it would completely envelop us and consume us and prevent us from ever again becoming whole. So it's that sense of it not happening to me. We can feel it at some level or know it at some level because we have to go through the rituals. Maybe identifying the body, planning a funeral, planning a memorial service. We go through those rituals, but it's as if we're sleepwalking through it. And many times I'll hear clients months later when they come for assistance, I don't remember what I did. I can't remember. And another way that grief affects us is sometimes I dial his number and then I remember. I can't believe he's gone. You think you hear their footsteps, or you think you see them in a crowd, or you hear their voice in a crowd. And sometimes we think we're crazy. Because again, it's not logical. But our heart isn't logical. That's your heart reacting to the possibility. So a sudden death is also experienced as a traumatic event. So that's another layer that you're also dealing with. Judith Herman says that a traumatic event are extraordinary occurrences, not because they rarely happen, but because they tax a person's normal coping strategies. So, I send my child to school, and I expect them to come home. This is my coping strategy. I make dinner, I do the laundry, I help them with their homework. I don't expect the knock on the door to say that they're not coming home. That then moves the goalposts over because it now becomes a trauma. Because it's taxing my ability to cope. With what? With what I think is normal. Is that right? Okay. And generally, a trauma is any threat to you or your loved one. So it's not that they happen when battery operated?
Thank you. Did you hit the button?
Okay. All right, I'm gonna hold it up here. How's that? So we know that there's big T traumas and small T traumas.
Okay, I'll get back. I didn't touch it.
So when you are dealing with any situation that you are not accustomed to, that you don't have the coping strategies, it's technically a traumatic event to you. But what's most important though is how the person interprets it, the meaning of the event.
So it's not just the event, it's the meaning of the event. So for example, I've had clients who have been raised by their grandparents, and their beloved grandparent dies, and they have no relationship with their parents. On the surface, that wouldn't appear to you and me, generally speaking, as a traumatic event. Because again, we're very orderly, we expect our parents and our grandparents to die before us. But the meaning that that death, my client has given to the event is much greater than that of a grandchild and a grandparent. Maybe this was the only source of support for that person. Maybe this was the only person who showed any love on a consistent basis, responded to their needs. Maybe they now feel all alone. Thank you.
So we can't judge a person's responses just by the facts. I'm always looking at what is the meaning to you. Yes, this was your husband, this was your wife, what about your cousin? I've had clients come to me and say, my cousin died, but she was like a sister to me. But I don't get the support because when I tell them my cousin died, they don't understand that. So it's the meaning that the event induces and what it does to the person. So you can actually experience traumatic event, a trauma, and not be traumatized by it. And there are ways that you can get through it without your life constricting, or without you always being hypervigilant. You can get on with functioning. So while it might have been traumatic, it doesn't have to traumatize you. Any questions about that? And that's what Peter Levine says. He says trauma is a fact of life. It does not, however, have to be a life sentence. You may have already experienced trauma-like symptoms, but if it's still fairly early on in your grief, it's not problematic. Most people report having experienced at least one traumatic event, been interpreted, been internalized as a traumatic event. But they don't necessarily, like I said, have to be traumatized. There is such a thing as called potentially traumatic events. I would certainly categorize, me having a stillborn as a trauma. No warning. Had to cope with the altered life, dreams. And I could have been traumatized by it. So in that case, while it could be considered a trauma in the literature, for me it was a potentially traumatic event. We as human beings have resilience. We are hardwired to survive. We may not always get what we imagined or we had hoped for, but that also comes then with changing our worldviews after a trauma. A sense of safety can be reestablished. The hypervigilance, as you spoke about, can be softened. There'll always be some, but certainly not that interrupts your functioning on a consistent basis. You can go through the remembering and mourning of your loved one. And you can also re-engage in ordinary life after a trauma. It is possible. We all have what we call certain core assumptions as human beings. We believe that the world is basically good and its people are basically good. We believe that life is meaningful, that things in the world make sense. We sort of might question why do certain things happen to certain people, but mostly we try to make sense of things. And we believe that we see ourselves in a positive light, and that I'm a good, moral person deserving of a good outcome. Most of us have these core beliefs. We also have certain basic needs as human beings. We need to feel safe, to trust others, as well as ourselves. We need to be able to have some agency or control over things in our life. We need to be of value, to contribute and value others. And we need to feel attached to other people. When these needs are met, they serve as buffers when we experience a trauma. And these needs are usually established in childhood from your first teachers, your caregivers. So if you're struggling with any of these needs, it's most likely related to your role models. But generally speaking, if these needs are met, they're what we call protective factors when we suffer a traumatic event. Doesn't mean we don't feel the pain, it just means there's a softer landing spot. We feel connected to people, we can reach out to people. We don't believe that we did anything bad to cause this to happen to us. We understand that sometimes really painful and unfair things happen in our lives, but we didn't do anything to deserve it. Dr. George Engel says that the loss of a loved one is psychologically traumatic to the same extent that being severely wounded or burned is physiologically traumatic. Now, do you remember me saying that if you broke your leg, I'd be there to help you, no problem. I can deal with a broken leg because I don't have to fix your tears. But it's just as important to get the support and for you to look after yourself in order to heal. So the process of mourning is the process whereby you heal your psychological wounds. Now that's very painful, this process. So what is mourning? So grief is what's happened to you, but mourning is how I deal with it. How do I express it outside of myself in some way, in a healthy way, and not let it stay and fester in me? The minute that your grief, thoughts, or feelings are expressed outside of yourself, it becomes mourning. And we do require some level of mourning beyond the funeral ritual in order to reconcile ourselves even to a traumatic loss. I detest the word closure. I do a whole presentation on closure. But I'm sure you've heard, have you had closure now that the funeral's over? Or now that you've had the memorial service? Like you can just wipe your hands clean and move on. I'm here to tell you that the process of learning to live in a world without your loved one begins after. Any questions? Anybody need a stretch break? Yes.
Just want to get back to that idea of blame and that whole idea of, I think a lot of us get caught up in our religious background of fearful of, although we've always been told loving God, but again, some of us come from a different generation, whereas the punishing God, the vengeful God, and this is, again, a strike as though you deserve this or they deserve this. But it's that whole idea, I think we have to overcome that idea that this was done to punish. I experienced this because I wasn't a loving son, I wasn't a loving husband, wife, whatever. But it's that, and then it goes back to that earlier point that I think, had I been there, had I spent more time with them, had I, this, we could have avoided this, or it could have turned out differently. And I think that, with that whole idea of blaming, and as you know, we say, things happen, right? They just do. But
Yeah, you make a lot of good points. Blame is related, again, to wanting a sense of control and wanting to know an outcome. So somebody has to have been responsible for this. And I can't think of a situation right now, but if nobody was responsible for a loved one's death, because there are unexplained deaths on that list of, right, sudden deaths. There's unexplained deaths, there's SIDS deaths, then we might reach to our higher power and say, why did this happen to them? Or why did this happen to me? I will also have clients say to me that my loved one died on me. Well, they didn't die on you. They died. Somebody else may have been responsible for, causing the death, but it wasn't to you. But again, we want to make sense. Our world needs to make sense. And sometimes we can get caught up if another person was involved in the death. We can get caught up and totally immersed in blaming and holding on to that blame and not processing the sad, not processing the missing. Because ultimately that's what it's for. Because no matter what happens, no matter what answers you get, it doesn't change the outcome. And that's what we try to do with the what ifs, the if onlys. It's called rewriting the outcome. Eventually we have to come to terms with rewriting our whole narrative. Not the outcome for that specific event. If my plan was to go this way, now I've got to rewrite it to go this way. Yeah, and you go back to God, and most people and most religions pray for certain outcomes. So, why did your child survive and my child didn't survive? I prayed. That doesn't make sense again. Did I do something wrong? Was I a bad parent? And that's the mourning part, and that's why it's so painful and no one likes to do it. But in the absence of that, you'll always be left with those questions. So most of us don't know how to deal with grief, to consciously work with the deep sadness. We try to deflect it, avoid it, distract ourselves from it, we hide from it, we try to escape from it. We're really good at mourning avoiding behaviors. We're really good at keeping busy, returning back to work so we don't face our grief, moving, self-soothing behaviors that are not healthy, self-medicating, overeating. Maybe if you've lost a partner, rushing into another relationship prematurely. because the pain is just too great, or we think the pain is too great that we can't bear it. But as I said before, we're capable of a lot. You have to believe that you can withstand those waves of grief. In terms of grieving, there are basically two intuitive and instrumental grievers are the opposite ends of a continuum. Intuitive grieving are those classic mourners. They're more emotional. They wear their emotions on their sleeve. They externalize their thoughts and feelings. They're usually labeled as over-emotional or stuck. Instrumental grievers are more introverted grievers. They do more reflection. They may like to work with their hands or create something in memory of. Many, many years ago, I had a young couple who had lost a child, and they were in a support group, and the mom was quite upset that she didn't see dad mourning or grieving. And there are differences between males and females. And he listened, he listened without saying a word, and then there was a pause. And he shared with the group that as a truck driver, before every run, because the runs would take him right past the cemetery, he would go early and stop and visit their son's grave, their baby's grave. That was his way of mourning. He didn't have to necessarily share it. Now, it might have been helpful for mom to understand, but I'm so glad he shared it that time. So very different styles. We're usually lean towards one or the other, but usually a combination of both. Stereotypically, males tend to be instrumental grievers and females tend to be intuitive grievers. I have a mom and dad right now who've lost their young adolescent child. And I see that. They're very much on the same page in terms of their dreams and their hopes, but their grief is expressed very differently. And I keep checking in with them. Are they understanding and tolerant and supportive of each other's grieving styles? So if you're experiencing any of that in your family system, just keep this in mind. The absence of overt mourning doesn't mean they're not mourning. Any questions about that? Yep.
Sorry to be, what was that?
Oh yeah, you're monopolizing
I
that.
don't understand these two words.
Oh, okay.
Like what would be an intuitive griever? What would be an example of an instrumental griever?
In the support, they usually go to support groups. They're crying. They're talking a lot. They may sit on the couch when they come home after work and they're immobilized. You know they're grieving. They're journaling. They're talking to their friends. They're using their friends for support. An instrumental griever might be more cognitive, more pragmatic. They're more pragmatic grievers. This particular dad that I was just speaking about, had purchased a recreational vehicle for him to use with his child, and didn't get a chance to go out. And now we're talking 4 months later, 5 months later, he decided he was going to go out, and that was his way of connecting with his child. But it took him 4 months. So it's more instrumental, it's more active grieving.
Tied to a ritual, perhaps?
A ritual, yep. Build your partner a shadow box. start a scholarship in memory of. Much more practical. Does that make sense?
Offer up masses going to
Yes.
religious rituals.
Yes. Not so much the overt, frequent crying and sharing of the story. But as I said, intuitive grievers get mislabeled as being too emotional. Because again, in our society, we like to keep everything nice and clean and logical. And we just haven't gotten it yet. Love isn't logical. If, however, you've done your mourning or you're trying to do your mourning and you're grieving, and you find that your grief is worsening, or you feel it's stagnated, you have a preoccupation with death, you continually go to places that are associated with your loved one, or conversely avoid places because it's a trigger, you start to feel that your life is meaningless, you have thoughts of self-harm, suicide, maybe your anger has progressed to bitterness and rage. That's when you really should be seeing a professional. Now again, this is sometime later. I'm not talking about when you're acutely grieving. Iris Bolton, after her son died by suicide, said, "I don't know why, I'll never know why, I don't have to know why. I don't like it. What I have to do is make a choice about my living." Now this is obviously after she asked the question many times. After she went through the process. So she just has to learn to live with the outcome. So do you remember us starting this time by breathing? When it's overwhelming, I want you to stop and breathe. Literally breathe. It's as simple, but as crucial as that. But we also know that breathing is self-regulating when we feel hypervigilant and anxious. And you remember that we talked about grief affects us emotionally, physically, spiritually, cognitively. You have to come up with a self-care plan that looks after all those realms. You have to attend to all of those things in order to get through this. And you're going to dose yourself with the grief. We can't be in that darkness 100%. So while you've brought your grief here, I don't see you mourning. You might be thinking about it, but you're actually focused on this, hopefully. So grief does come in waves. It gives us a reprieve every so often. So put the grief down. Pick up life until the next time grief hits you over the head. And as much as there are triggers, there's also glimmers. Allow yourself to experience glimmers. Those are just moments of being present and enjoying whatever it is you're enjoying. You might feel a tinge of guilt, but that's also part of that process. It's okay to ask those questions. That's part of the process. That's part of the mourning. Ask the whys, the what ifs. You might hear from friends and family and colleagues that it doesn't make any difference. Maybe not to the outcome, but it will make a difference in how you live the rest of your life. We cannot do this alone. Remember me talking about needs, that we need other people? We can't do it alone. It doesn't have to necessarily be professional help. And while you're acutely grieving, please don't expect your normal self. Don't expect your normal energy levels, your normal thinking patterns, your normal emotional. It's not going to happen. And you don't want to be putting more stress on yourself other than what grief has already brought into your life. Slowly reestablish routines. Again, one moment at a time, one day at a time, one step at a time, slowly. That's what we as clinicians want to see. We want to see some progress towards re-engaging with life. Please don't keep busy for the sake of avoiding your grief. It's good to have routines. It's good to be distracted. It's okay to go out to a movie every now and then or binge on Netflix. It's not good to do that when you know instinctively you've avoided your grief. This will come towards the end of the acute grieving phase. That's when you have to explore the meaning, your worldview. Is the world still a good place? Am I still worthy? So your perception of the world is going to be altered. And your job also is to find meaning in what's ever happened to you. When we get too attached to our pain, it becomes suffering. But you can turn that pain into purpose. And that purpose might give you meaning to keep going on with a good life. Be patient. It's never as quick as we'd like it to be. Trust the process. And return to the basics when you're overwhelmed. Breathe, one moment at a time. Do what you have to do just for the next moment. Don't think too far in advance, because that can be overwhelming. And believe you're resilient. Once you've done the hard work of acute grieving, what better way is to become resilient and to live a good life in memory of your loved one. Have patience with everything unresolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves as if they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. Don't search for the answers which you could not be given to you now because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps then someday far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer. Trust that you can withstand the pain and trust that you can get through this. We just don't know when. We don't know when it's going to heal like a broken bone. So I will leave you with this. Any questions or comments? Anything you'd like me to review? I thank you for coming out tonight, for showing me your willingness to engage with your pain. So while this might feel like you're doing this for you, you're also doing it in memory of your loved one. So don't waste your grief. And I hope you eventually can turn your pain into some sort of meaning and purpose. Thank you, everyone. Good night.